Thank you, comrades, for coming here for this important discussion on Canadian perspectives in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. I'd like to start the meeting by commemorating the fact that this weekend marks the fifth anniversary of the death of our comrade, Camilo Calles. And we should not forget that everything we have achieved, everything we are doing now, would not be possible without the actions and the sacrifices of those who came before us, like Camilo, like other great socialist fighters. And that's the legacy we are attempting to build. A new society that is worthy of the sacrifices of those who came before. And that's why it's so important that we have these discussions. That is so important that we unite the revolutionary struggle in order to overthrow this rotten system. Now, Lenin said that capitalism is horror without end. And we are seeing that on a global scale with the coronavirus crisis. Coronavirus is, in many ways, it's the great revealer. It's revealed all of the weaknesses of all of the elements of society that are on the brink, are on the edge, and just needed the smallest touch in order to collapse over the edge. And coronavirus is not the smallest touch. Now, in and of itself, it is a historical accident. That it wasn't, you couldn't predict exactly that this disease would come at this time, but it's one of any number of crises that would put a unstable system over the edge. A stable society, a society with well-funded healthcare, a society with well-funded public health, with a good scientific approach to human relations, would be able to weather this crisis, would be able to efficiently shut down non-essential services, do mass testing, identify who's infected and who isn't, and would provide all the personal protective equipment to weather this storm. But this is not the capitalism that we are living under. This is not a healthy society. This is a sick, senile, decrepit society on the brink of crisis. That is the capitalism we are living under. And this accident of COVID-19 has revealed all of the underlying contradictions, whether they're social contradictions, economic contradictions, contradictions of world relations, environmental contradictions, all of it together, all of this crisis. This society stands upon a cliff edge and now has been pushed over. You can even see that cliff edge on the graphs of unemployment and of growth, GDP, of the stock market, etc., etc., etc. All have gone off a cliff. Oil prices, all of it, off a cliff. This is the capitalist society we live under. And it is literally a life or death situation. It's a life or death situation. In Canada, you go to old folks' homes, long-term care, and they are literally hell on earth. Actually, they were terrible places even before COVID-19. Significantly underfunded, understaffed. Why? Purely because of the profit motive. And a large number of them are run by private enterprises, funded with government money, but for profit enterprises. And what do? They don't hire enough staffing. They don't hire, the staff that they do hire are part-time, no benefits, low wage, terrible conditions. And that forces these workers to work, numerous different care homes and spread the disease around. But even before then, you had crises of, well, you had diseases being spread around and a higher mortality rate than you should have had. You have people not getting the care they need, people living in soiled clothing, not being changed, not being fed. And now that there's stories of various long-term care agencies with like 40, 50 people dead in Ontario and Quebec, with almost everybody infected, including the staff, not the correct personal protective equipment, all because of money and the profit motive, that this society cannot take care of those of us in retirement, the people who've spent a life giving themselves for the profit of the capitalists, and then the capitalists cannot sustain that. So it's horror without end. Actually, there's even stories now, because of the infection rates and because of the trouble finding staff, that there's a danger of starvation, that people in these homes are not even being fed because they're not reaching the staffing levels. And another particular crisis that we've seen in the current pandemic is in Alberta. You've got these meat packing plants and they've got like 2,500 workers packed into these plants. A lot of them are immigrant workers. Some of them are temporary foreign workers. A lot of them have from a Somali background, and the bosses use and abuse that to highly exploit these workers who work side by side by side by side. There is no social isolation there. There's no social isolation. And when the union raised this concern that they had the first instances of infections on the workplace, and the workers were saying that this is unsafe, we cannot work here, and they called in the Ministry of Labour for an inspection, right to refuse unsafe work. Every worker's got the right to refuse unsafe work, supposedly. And then you make a phone call to the Ministry of Labour, who is supposed to send an inspector to do an inspection. But now, send an inspector means some guy on FaceTime. Who they did this. Can you think of a more crass example of the fact that it's unsafe, that it's too unsafe for the inspector to even go there? So he doesn't want to go there. He goes there by FaceTime and ticks off, it's all safe. It's all safe. And so they continued production. They ignored the warnings of the union. And now, out of a plant of something like 2,000 people, 1/3 of all of the Canada's beef supply, that about over 500 workers are now infected, 1 in 4, probably more than that. And 3 have died, as the last time I saw it. And probably more will die. This just goes to show you how, for the capitalists, profits come before people. Profits come before people. And they had the gall to try to use the race card, try to use the racism to blame the immigrant workforce as like, oh, we don't know whether this was at the workplace. And, the people working here, they have cultural practices that, they don't socially isolate. Bullshit. Total bullshit. Totally blaming the victim. Yes, these immigrant workers are in tightly cramped accommodations and are forced to carpool to go to work. But why is that? Because they are paid so very little by the corporation. So everything comes back to Cargill, the meat packer, there. And it's a total scandal. And these imbalances are repeated again and again and again and again and again. And it's causing real anger. And you're getting outbursts of working class struggle, spontaneous bottom-up working class struggle, spontaneous walkouts. You've had that in terms of transit workers. You've had that in long-term care and healthcare workers not getting the personal protective equipment, the PPE, not getting what they need, and say, no, we are not doing this work. We are not putting our lives on the line for your profit. It's incredibly inspiring to see the development of the class consciousness. Even right-wing magazines are quoting Lenin or Engels, saying that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. This is the situation we are in now, and that is the incredibly revolutionary nature of consciousness. Actually, we've said this before. The most revolutionary thing you can say about human consciousness, that is inherently conservative. Consciousness resists change. People don't like change. Why would you like change? Something changes for working class people, it gets worse. People resist change and try to make do within the status quo. But by saying that consciousness resists change, when people start seeing the reality of things, consciousness catches up in a bang, in a revolutionary way. And you're seeing that with various sectors, that large numbers of people are seeing the actions of the bosses, the governments, the corporations, who do not care about the lives of working class people. They are just trying to maximize profit. And that was the logic of the Ministry of Labour in Alberta, that they were just trying to... there was no way to have the slaughterhouse open. Slaughterhouse, there's an apt term. No way to have the slaughterhouse open while maintaining physical isolation. And so they came to the conclusion, well, these workers are expendable. These workers aren't much better than the beef carcasses that are being butchered there. They are just an adjunct to the machine, the adjunct to the profit motive. That is the way that the capitalists live. And they try to say that we're all in this together. We're all supposedly in this together. Well, that is so much bunk, that there is one coronavirus for the rich and another coronavirus for the poor, for the working class, and for the marginalized. That you've seen, they actually refuse to do statistics in Canada, but the statistics in the States show that Black and Latino and poor populations are massively overrepresented in the deaths due to COVID-19. And anecdotally, I'm almost certain that exactly the same conditions are applying within Canada. You're getting the specific concentration in long-term care, the underfunding, the criminal negligence there. But if you think about it, if you are rich, you can stay in your large house comfortably and collect your dividends and be isolated. You're not forced to go out into public transit, nothing like that. So you're much less likely to get infected. And if even then you still get infected, then the rich can purchase better healthcare, have better nutrition, better sleep, better housing, all of these social determinants of health, so that a rich person who gets infected is much less likely to enter into complications and need hospitalization and being put on a ventilator or anything like that. Whereas poor people, much more likely to be in a job that's deemed an essential service, whether or not it actually is an essential service, like condo building is still going on, totally ridiculous, totally unnecessary, but much more likely to be in an essential workplace. If you think about the food service workers, the grocery store workers, who were totally demeaned under capitalism. Said, these people don't deserve a higher minimum wage. This is unskilled labor, all the rest of it. And all the right wing saying that, no, these people don't deserve any improvements. Well, now these are the workers which everybody is relying upon to live. Who is essential? Who is the creative class? Who is essential? Is it your stockbroker? Is it your captain of industry? No, they are doing nothing. They are totally unessential, superfluous to society. Who is essential? Your transit worker, your grocery store worker, your food service worker, your healthcare worker. These are the people who are really essential, and people see that. And yet, so they're forcing these low-paid workers into work, forcing them on mass public transit. So they're much more likely to get infected. They're much more likely to be in poor housing, have the stress of low pay and insecurity, so bad sleep. That all affects your immune system. And so these workers are more likely to get sick, and if they do get sick, are more likely to die. That is the capitalism we live under in Canada and internationally. We are not all of this in this together. And that consciousness is starting to develop in certain areas. We're also having a fantastic rent strike movement. Fantastic rent strike movement that 15% of renters didn't pay their rent in April. This was actually relayed as a defeat for the rent strike movement because 85% paid their rent. Well, 15% didn't, and given the conditions, that's actually quite significant. We'll see what happens May 1st. Now, there are weaknesses in this rent strike movement, the definite weaknesses in that it's been organized in a individualist manner, that each individual renter is individually trying to go up against their landlord. And it's just over the issue of whether or not to pay rent. Well, in fact, this should be organized. This is actually a wobbly idea, industrial workers of the world, an anarcho-syndicalist idea of rent payers unions, of tenants unions, to develop demands and put them to the landlords as a mass, as the ruling class and their state, with issues that relate to rent. So, moratorium on all rents during the lockdown period, and a moratorium on all utilities. So these things that are directly related to housing. Also opening up hotels and underused housing to homeless people or cramped people. That, those things directly relate to housing, but a mass rent strike, can also be a tool aimed at the government, saying, no, we want everybody, all non-essential industries shut down, that genuinely essential workers get double hazard pay, and that there is workers' control to decide what is and is not essential, and all necessary PPE. These are demands which collectively a rent strike or a walkout could achieve, could put forward. And unfortunately, it hasn't happened in a systematic way. But this is the developing revolutionary consciousness of the workers. That's where things are heading. We don't actually know how long this lockdown period is going to last. But there is this tension between seeing the reality of we are not all in this together, that there's one COVID for the rich and another for the poor. So people are forced to fight back. But there's also been a certain rallying around various leaders, whether it's Legault in Quebec or Trudeau or Doug Ford, etc. They've all experienced a bump in popularity. And this makes sense. You've actually got this extreme polarization. You're seeing spontaneous working class action, rent strikes, walkouts, etc. on one side, and you're seeing a rallying of public opinion around the bourgeois leadership. And there's a very clear reason behind that. It's actually hope that the idea that the ruling class and the leaders don't know what they're doing, well, that is incredibly scary. That's incredibly frightening, to think that the guardians of the status quo, the people that everybody is supposedly relying upon to live, don't know what they're doing and don't care about you. That is very frightening. And so people would resist taking that conclusion, because the conclusion to that is it's a very scary prospect of need for working class people to ditch this ruling class and run things themselves. So people, that inherent conservatism is going to resist that. And so there will be a period of, rallying around the maple leaf or the fleur-de-lis for a period. But reality, that opinion butts its head up against reality more and more. And the longer and longer this crisis, this lockdown continues, the more that national unity sentiment will be eroded, and there will be sort of spontaneous outbursts, which will be quite popular. But it's tough for people to do that themselves. Actually, another statistic in terms of the fact that we're not all in this together is there was a recent statistics on unemployment, that those who've been laid off due to COVID, well, in those around $14 an hour, around the minimum wage, about 1 in 3 workers have been laid off and lost their job. Minimum wage workers, gig workers. This is also the gig employment sector and service sector. 1 in 3 have lost their job. Whereas if you go to the top tax bracket, people are earning more than $100,000 a year, only 5% of them have been laid off in this crisis. And so it's essentially, if you go down the income scale, it's pretty much a straight line between 35% and 5%, depending on people's income, between $14 an hour and whatever $100,000 a year equates to. So this starts trickling down to the consciousness. And so, yes, we don't know how long this lockdown is going to go. There are reports that perhaps the infection rates are stabilizing. I think, about 1,000 or 1,500 new infections per day, that it seems to be flattening off. We'll see. We shall see. Absolutely no credit to the capitalists, who would keep everything open as long as possible. And the entire credit goes to working class people who voluntarily sacrificed to stay home and do what is needed, despite the actions of the bosses and the bankers trying to maintain the profit motive. So the only credit goes to working class people, not to the bourgeoisie. And but we'll see how long it takes and whether there's a second wave. But also what you're now getting is from resisting the lockdown in the first stage, now the various sections of the capitalists are clamoring to open up, make profit, more profit. They don't care about people, right? Le Gaulle was talking about young people going back to work because they're not so, supposedly not so at risk as old people, which, that reminds you of a biblical plague and the death of the firstborn son. And of course, Le Gaulle and the other bosses and bankers, they're not sacrificing their children. They're demanding that the children and the young people from the working class go out and sacrifice their health and their families. But we'll see how long the lockdown lasts and whether they open up too soon and trigger off a second wave. because all they care about is the profit. But the longer this continues, yes, there is real opportunities for increasing radicalization, fight back, a refusal of the working class to be used as disposable cannon fodder by the bourgeoisie. So we'll see how that develops. We'll see how that develops and what degrees of struggle happen during the lockdown. But what will happen after? That is just as much, if not more important. What will happen after the lockdown period ends or starts being thawed? And we are in the mother of all economic crisis. This is way worse than the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. This is on par with the Great Depression, but it may even be worse than that. That over the last month, approximately 8 million Canadians accessed various forms of unemployment benefit, either EI, the woefully inadequate unemployment insurance system. I think there's about 1 million in that system, and then about 7 million have accessed the CERB, Trudeau's $2,000, which is insufficient and is not enough to cover an average one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. But there's 8 million people are on some form of assistance. They're talking about unemployment going to 25% or even higher. You cannot tell. You cannot know exactly where it's going to end up. And in fact, you look at past periods to try and create analogies and try and understand what period you're in. But really, there is no precedent for this situation. There is no precedent for this situation. An economic crisis triggered off by a pandemic that practically shuts down the economy. So nobody really knows where this is going to end up. But it is, it's a crisis on top of a crisis that we've been predicting. The International Marxist Tendency and Fightback, La Riposte Socialiste, have been predicting a slump. We've written numerous articles about this over the last year or so, saying that we are on the precipice of a classical crisis of overproduction. And it takes just one little accident, one little thing to spark it off. Well, it wasn't a little thing that sparked it off. It was COVID that sparked it off. But the crisis was already there. The capitalist crisis of overproduction, exacerbated by several confounding factors, one being debt, consumer debt, household debt, 175% of annual income. Now, that was before COVID. God knows what it is now. The statistics will be going through the roof. Household debt. Related to that, a massive mortgage debt, which is due to the housing bubble. That Toronto and Vancouver, two of the largest housing bubbles on the planet. And then you've also got the manufacturing crisis, the sectoral degeneration of manufacturing in Southern Ontario and Quebec. That was the basis of the post-war social contract in Canada. High unionization rates, militant strikes got important wages and benefits that were then generalized to the rest of the working class. And so you've got the manufacturing crisis, the housing crisis, the debt crisis, and then specifically on the prairies, the oil crisis. That Alberta has been in crisis over the collapse in oil prices since 2014, when oil went from $100 oil down to $30 oil. It recovered a little bit to sort of $50, $60. But now you don't have $50 oil, you don't have $30 oil, you don't have $5 oil. Sometimes you have minus $5 oil. This is a death of an entire industry and a death of the province of Alberta and the prairies that rely upon this. So Canada, from being in a relatively privileged position in 2008, is now incredibly weak due to these various pillars: debt, housing, oil, manufacturing, all serve to drag down Canada, even if COVID didn't happen. And we don't know how long the lockdown's going to be. We don't know how long it's going to be. But even when the lockdown is over, it will inevitably end sooner or later, with or without a vaccine. It will end. Things will, well, they won't go back to normal, but they will go to a different abnormal. But eventually people will come out of their houses, but the crisis of overproduction and all of these other crises will remain. And it's not like the post-Second World War period, the 50s and the 60s, that the boom of those decades was based upon post-war reconstruction and the expansion of world trade. Post-war reconstruction actually was a bonus to global growth all the way up to 1958. And then the dominance of US imperialism managed to batter down trade barriers, so partially alleviate the contradiction between the private ownership of the means of production and the nation state, have an increased international division of labor, increased efficiency in the capitalist market with reduced tariff barriers and increased trade. So that was an explanation of that growth period of the 50s and 60s. Is this what we are entering? Well, during the Second World War, you had capital was destroyed on a massive level, which allowed the post-war reconstruction. Well, COVID is killing people. COVID is forcing people to stay home, but it's not destroying capital. It's not destroying machinery or plant or anything like that. To rebalance the supply and demand, to rebalance the rate of profit in society, in Marx's Capital explains that you must have the destruction of capital. They call it the creative destruction of capital. That is not occurring in this. That is not occurring. So the underlying crisis of the system is not going to be solved by COVID. In fact, it's going to be exacerbated. Debt, huge debt. I don't have the precise statistics. Actually, I don't think that the governments have got the precise statistics, but I think approximately the value of the various support mechanisms and the bailouts is approximately $500 billion in Canada, when the Canadian GDP is around $2 trillion. So it's 25% of Canadian GDP that is going to be added to government debt. So all of the debt is going to be exacerbated. People who've been laid off are going to be forced to use their credit cards, their line of credit, all the rest of that to just buy the groceries. So that's going to increase the personal debt, and people aren't going to be able to maintain their mortgage payments. So they're going to go into default. That's going to increase the debt. And so the debt crisis is going to be incredibly exacerbated: government, corporate, and personal debt. And that will play a role of hampering any future recovery, because when the economy supposedly starts recovering, then the surplus should be ploughed back into production, when in fact the surplus won't go into production, it will go into debt repayments. So you've got that. And housing, again, I can't envision a world where the housing market recovers from this. Actually, even you've got all these Airbnb houses that are coming back onto the market, and they're actually pushing down rent rates and pushing down the housing market, because they were part of taking what should have been part of housing off the market for short-term profit. And so the housing bubble almost certainly going to burst. Manufacturing. Well, manufacturing relies upon exports. This is a foundational part of Canadian manufacturing, Canadian economy. There's really two pillars of the Canadian economy in terms of a global trade. On the one side is oil, and the other side is manufacturing. And manufacturing, approximately 35% of Canadian GDP, or 32%, I think, of Canadian GDP is exports, whereas compared to 12% in the United States. So Canada is incredibly dependent upon selling its manufactured goods on foreign markets, and therefore is dependent upon free trade. Well, is free trade likely to be promoted in the years to come? Not bloody likely, given Donald Trump and general tendencies. In fact, you're seeing a collapse of free trade. Again, this is not like the 50s and 60s, where free trade was the general tendency. The tendency is, in fact, to protectionism, to increased economic nationalism. That is going to particularly affect Canada more than the United States or other countries that aren't so reliant upon world trade. That protectionism, and that seems to be a general phenomenon, and in fact it's an important. It's not just an economic phenomenon; it'll be an important political phenomenon. This came about when Trump was blocking the export of N95 masks from the United States to Canada. He said, no, we need that. America first. Need those in America, and there was a wave of revulsion amongst the Canadian population, working class included, justifiably, because people will die without those masks, and the US taking in America first, but not just the US, even Europe as well. They're taking not just a Europe first, but a Germany first or a Britain first, etc. Perspective. That Germany didn't even send masks to Italy, which was on the front lines of the crisis. So the whole structure of globalization of world trade is breaking down, and this does have the effect of strangling the capitalist market. You end up exchanging more labor for fewer commodities. The whole system gets less efficient. It leads to inflation, leads to higher prices of everything that you're importing. That's what protectionism does. But and so it's and that is also the story of the 1930s. That's why the Great Depression lasted for a decade after 1929, because of protectionism, of trade barriers, tariff barriers, competitive devaluations. And that will affect Canada particularly bad. But it's also, there's a political side to this, that after Trump blocked those masks, there was a wave of economic nationalist sentiment in Canada. I was like, why are we relying upon an unreliable trading partner of Trump's USA when we should make that stuff at home? We should be self-sufficient. And we have to understand there is both a progressive and a reactionary side to this. That it actually also has deep roots in Canadian working class history. that we shouldn't forget the NDP waffle, the left-wing tendency within the NDP in the late 60s and early 70s, was based upon left-wing nationalism, left nationalism. And actually they said at the time, well, the majority of Canadian industry is US owned, and therefore the solution to that is to, if Canada wants its independence, genuine independence, it needs to nationalize all US assets, which obviously would be a progressive revolutionary demand, but we came from the wrong nationalist perspective, wrong nationalist route. But you could understand it from the perspective of a worker who wants to, we don't want to be dependent upon Trump and foreign capitalists. We've got to be independent. And of course, but the bourgeois, they lean upon that progressive sentiment and say, yeah, let's support Canadian industry. Well, this wouldn't, Canadian bosses, Canadian private ownership. Well, look, what's the difference between Bombardier and Galen Weston versus the American capitalists? There's no difference. Those billionaires have got far more in common with each other than they have with the workers in their own countries. And us Canadian workers have got much more in common with US workers than we have with our own bourgeois bastards. So we got to avoid that nationalist sort of class collaborationist perspective on economic independence. But we can't just reject it in a crass way and say, oh, aren't you silly? You should be internationalist. You should be in favor of free trade. Well, all then you're doing is putting yourselves on the side of the big bourgeois, the bankers, and the finance capital that wants free trade. So it's not a choice between, a national endogenous industry versus, finance capital free trade. The point is we base ourselves upon the working class. And we say, yeah, we do need to be economically independent. We, the working class, need to be economically independent. And that's where you do connect with the progressive part of the Waffle Manifesto, which was nationalization, workers' control, expropriation. That if we want to control all medical equipment and essential services, expropriate them, put them under workers' control. That's our demand, rather than just telling people, no, you should be internationalists, then putting yourself on the side of bankers. No. We say correctly, we should control this. We, the working class, workers' control, expropriation. So it's important we don't fall into that left nationalist trap and fall behind the national bourgeoisie like Stalinists have in the past. So protectionist sentiment will be particularly damaging for Canada. The debt, yes, the debt will drag everything down. And housing crisis, yes, it seems be amazing if the housing bubble reinflated. No, it seems to be burst. And then we come to Alberta and oil. Yes, incredible. People were like, how on earth do you get negative oil? How on earth is a barrel of oil worth -5? Actually, I think it was even sort of like at its depths, it was at negative $40 a barrel. And this is because, again, it's the crisis of overproduction. There is too much oil, and it's so much oil that they don't have the storage for it. So they're desperately trying to get people to take this oil off their hands because they don't have the storage. It's insane. It is literally insane. This is an insane system that cannot produce for profit, even though that is its purpose, is production for profit, cannot solve the environmental crisis. And this is a total disaster for Alberta, and a total disaster of this industry, because the sort of break-even point on the bitumen, the inefficient thick oil from Alberta. I think it's around $60-70. I cannot conceive oil coming back to those prices for a very, very long time. And yet they're demanding government bailouts, $7.5 billion to a pipeline that is going to take oil to, give away at negative money. It's ridiculous. This is not sustainable. Actually, Jason Kenney, yes, demanding government handout after government handout. It's like he's suddenly become a socialist. He's suddenly become a welfare bum, not based upon the dynamic free market economy. No. Give me a government handout. Give me a handout. Give me a handout. Gimme. It's socialism for the rich and capitalism for the rest of us. This industry is dead. It is totally dead. That it'll take a long way before this oil is economic again. And so this has huge social and economic implications on the prairies that will play out over the coming years. And the next issue is austerity. So they're taking on all these debts, $500 billion of debt, and we'll see, and then some more. And they're giving all these gifts to big business and the banks. And the question always comes down to who pays? Who pays? Is it the poor or is it the rich? That is the driving force of the majority of revolutions in human history. Who pays? And that is going to be the world after COVID. Actually, not just after COVID, during. Austerity is already starting to rear its head. Vancouver City Council, I think, laid off 1,200 people. The Toronto Transit Commission also laid off 1,200. The Manitoba government is demanding 30% cuts in every department. The austerity is coming. They're making the workers pay, and this is only going to get worse. The Toronto City Council, now municipalities cannot go into deficit, and so they have no choice but to implement cuts right away. Toronto City Council said it's going to be in something like a $2.8 billion deficit, and one would assume that similar rates of deficit would occur in all the municipalities across the country. And so that is where that will be the front line of that austerity struggle. The municipalities, but then the province, and then the feds. There may be a bailout for the municipalities, or a partial bailout. We shall see. But if there is, then that is just putting that onto further debt. And you have this contradiction that Trotsky explained in the 1920s in the discussions in the first 5 years of the Communist International, fantastic collection of books, that Trotsky explained that there is both a social equilibrium and an economic equilibrium. And to maintain the social equilibrium, then the only way to do that is to rack up the debt, bailout after bailout after bailout. But to rebalance the economic equilibrium, they need to balance the budget and implement austerity. So these two things are in total contradiction. May add that also austerity cuts the market, like you saw in Greece, that the implementation of austerity cuts the market even further and exacerbates the crisis of overproduction. So it's an extreme situation of austerity versus punting it down the road, a bit of both, not solving the crisis. And then they've moved to, beyond debt, a new old method of solving the crisis, which is printing money, quantitative easing, gifting money to the big banks, creating it out of nothing. And as that trickles down to the rest of society, well, they've devalued the value of money. So that makes everything more expensive. So inflation has also historically been a driver of class struggle, that people's wages cannot keep up with the cost of living anymore, and people demand higher wages, better conditions to keep up with inflation. Combined with protectionism is also inflationary, because you have to buy more expensive products because they've got a tariff on top of them, or they're less efficiently produced. So you've got that inflation crisis on top of that. That is the situation we're heading into. Real crisis. And this is a new period. People again, even revolutionaries, they say that revolutionaries can be some of the most conservative people. And even revolutionaries resist change and think that, well, things continue the same way as before. Like normally we wouldn't just call for a spontaneous wildcat walkout over an health and safety issue, because normally that would be ultra left. That would be quite unrealistic to expect that workers would just drop down tools and just head out of the job. Normally we'd advocate, no, you go to your union and you demand that your union leadership act, and you criticize union leadership for not acting. But this is a life or death situation. This is people's consciousness is changing month by month, week by week, day by day, hour by hour. And people cannot wait for a labour bureaucracy to act. And are taking events into their own hands in the here and now. But we should also analyse what is happening in terms of the workers' organisations, the organisations that the workers built. Well, largely, they have been paralysed. They have been liquidated. The first statements out of the Canadian Labour Congress is, "We are united with bosses," and giving applause to the federal government's totally insufficient actions. Yeah, utterly criminal. And the NDP the federal NDP was doing similar things, applauding the corporate bailouts, also applauding the sort of insufficient supports. Trudeau's 2000. Actually, the NDP said that this was their idea, and now the NDP is in favour of universal basic income. In effect, that this idea, from being a fairly marginal idea on being kind of policy wonkish, that it's the people with their heads buried in books and never did any real politics that were in favour of UBI in the past period, has become a mass phenomenon, that the reformists, like the NDP leadership, have come on board with UBI, and the Liberals are partially implementing a UBI, even temporarily, the CERB, the $2,000. And this has raised the question, should Marxists be supporting a universal basic income? And I think the clue is the fact that the reformists who are refusing to support wildcats and refusing to support rent strikes. Actually, if any major Labour leader had come out in favour of wildcats and right to refuse walkouts, a stay-at-home strike, and the rent strikes, it would have massive support. None of them have, because they're utterly afraid. But if anyone of them had, but the fact that these people who have betrayed the working class, and even partially the Liberals, are coming on board with basic income, I think that's a clue for Marxists, don't you? I think that's totally a clue that this is not a way forward for the working class. Because what does UBI do? Well, in some ways, it is, depending upon the conception, it is either reactionary or utopian, right? The right-wingers who support UBI, well, they want to pay for it by eradicating all social programs. And that's the way they'd get the money to give everybody cash. And that actually ends up being the workers lose more, because the value of those social services, the social wage, is far more than the cash payment. You see that comparing Canadian and American healthcare, that Canadians for a universal system pay, I think, about $2,500 per head, whereas Americans for a private system that excludes 40, 50 million people pay $3,500 per head. So Canadians get more and pay less. So if you think about it, if you liquidated the Canadian medical health system and gave everybody a $2,500 check, then for exchange for the American system, people would end up being $1,000 worse off. So that's the right-wing conception of universal basic income. But the reformists, they're actually very specifically not clear where they're getting the money from. They're not clear where they're getting the money from. And that's the question. Who pays? And that's what determines our approach to these things. Like Trudeau's $2,000, who's going to pay? The workers are going to pay. And that $2,000 is really very, very briefly in the hands of the worker before it gets taken by the landlord and Galen Weston and the buying essential groceries. So it is another form of handout to the bosses, which is then going to be paid for by austerity. So we cannot support these things. We're not going, once everybody's getting $2,000, we're not going to say, no, you shouldn't have $2,000. No. But what we say is make the bosses pay. Make the bosses pay. That our demand is full pay for all workers, double danger pay for essential workers, and for workers control all the essential PPE and the rest of it. It's make the bosses pay, and if the bosses say they can't pay, open the books. And if they genuinely can't pay, nationalize them under workers' control. These are demands that facilitate workers' power. Whereas UBI, well, it actually accommodates the worker to poverty wages. It subsidizes poverty wages and poverty conditions and the gig economy and all this shit. And it subsidizes that. And it just leads to people looking for the government dole. And again, it's another subsidy to the capitalists, where in fact we should emphasize fighting the capitalists. And that's why we say on the one side it's reactionary, UBI, it's on the liquidation of social programs. On the other side it's utopian, it's where does the money come from? Because most of the time the reformists aren't honest enough and say they will tax the rich and do this. But even taxing the rich, that's a very limited slogan that we are only in favour of if it is a adjunct to nationalisation and workers' control. Because tax the rich, well, the rich still control society. And it is utopian in the sense that you just tax the rich, they're not going to invest. It actually destroys the economy. That's the lesson of Venezuela, actually. That is left reformism in action. That they didn't nationalise, they left the commanding heights of the economy in control of the ruling class, and they couldn't. And that's led to mass inflation and economic crisis as the bourgeoisie refuses to invest. So you need to nationalise. Or, if usually the reformists don't have the guts to tax the rich, so then they put on more debt, that it creates its own crisis, or they print money, inflation. So it's all an attempt to avoid the question of ownership and the question of the control of production. That's why we reject this and demand workers' control and expropriation. That's what I make the bosses pay. Make the bosses pay. You cannot skirt around this issue. But yes, it brings us back to the workers' leaders, that they've essentially liquidated the mass organizations. It's playing no role. And there must be accountability for these people, for their lack of action. There absolutely must be accountability. But that will come tomorrow. It's a life or death question today. People need to survive today. But the failure to act, the failure to support walkouts and rent strikes by the workers' leaders, that will be remembered. And so in the reconstruction period, if you like, in the post-COVID period, then these organizations will play an important role, but it'd be a very different working class that will demand different actions. And you can see that they've been moved to the left, that they are largely irrelevant in the consciousness of workers. These bureaucrats they get their high pay checks off the backs of the dues of essential workers. They can quite safely stay home, still quite comfortable, and not do anything. But even they're still feeling the pressure to a certain degree, that especially the healthcare unions feel very sharp pressure from their rank and file to put demands. So from total inaction, they are then tail-ending the workers and being forced to the left. And in a sense, also, you see these drib by drab rollout of various support mechanisms from the Liberal government that are not sufficient, half-hearted, lots of cracks, everything. But again, that's the pressure of the workers on the workers' leaders, on the NDP, and then eventually on the Liberals. The NDP ends up being 1 week to the left of the Liberals, and that's what the Liberals commit to. But there has been a massive change in consciousness, and there will be even bigger changes in consciousness. And that's why the international Marxist tendency, why Fightback and La Riposte Socialiste are so very important now. There are huge defensive struggles, life or death struggles for the working class in the here and now, to save the only progressive and creative class in society, the working class. Have been proved the only ones. The working class are the people we rely upon, everybody relies upon to survive, to eat, to live. And the capitalists have shown themselves to be complete parasites, have no progressive, no creative purpose in society. Well, that new human race, that new working class with a new consciousness, will enter a new society of austerity and crisis. And Canada will not be in the last line of that. And it's absolutely vital that we build upon our incredible successes, that the forces of Marxism in Canada have quadrupled in size in the last 4 or 5 years on the basis of the existing radicalization. 58% of Canadians have said they support socialism. And this is much more pronounced amongst the young and amongst the poor. People were looking for socialist ideas even before this crisis. But now this crisis hits, there's a mass rejection of capitalism. Actually, nobody's a capitalist anymore. Everybody's in favor of some form of state intervention. And the question is, who controls that state intervention? Is it state capitalism for the interests of the capitalists? Or is it genuine workers' control, genuine socialism, bottom-up workers' democracy? That's the question. Is it nationalization for who? Well, their nationalization and ours. And no government bailouts, so no corporate bailouts. That really will radicalize opinion. So the Marxists need to be there, absolutely need to be there. We've made great successes, but we're going to make even more successes. That in history, the Marxists organized with the international Marxist tendency are poised to play a vital role, an absolute vital role in the struggles to come. And so I talk to the comrades here. We must learn the lessons of history. We must educate themselves and then give young workers, students, and the working class and trade unions these ideas and these methods. We do not have to accept this system that is killing working class people. We do not have to accept it. We will go out and give these ideas. We will organize, and the Marxists will be numbered in the thousands in Canada and tens and thousands, and make the decisive difference. Thank you.